My presentation is entitled Music, Dance, and the Iconography of Cultural Exchange on the Antebellum Upper Mississippi. I'd like simply to begin by being silent for a few moments, in acknowledgement of all those thousands upon thousands of voices that have been silenced in or erased from our history. Particularly at this historical moment, it seems essential that the work that we do in every instance seek to center those unheard voices and to dismantle the structures that have silenced them. The Mississippi, from the Ojibwe Mississippi, the Big River, has been a critical avenue for trade and exchange for as long as indigenous people and then settler people have occupied North America, and its spaces, beaches, decks, wharves, and waterfront taverns, have been the venues for cultural exchange for nearly as long. Like all riverine sites, its complex collisions of historical, political, colonial, economic, and artistic events have helped shape multicultural American musical identity. Writers from Lafcadio Hearn to Mark Twain, and multi-ethnic performers from Old Cornmeal to Thomas Dartmouth Rice, among many others, have chronicled the rivers they saw and in whose musics they participated. Waterfronts, however, are tricky liminal places. Whether riverine or maritime, freshwater or salt, riverbank or harborfront, the place where the water meets the land has been for millennia a place of exchange. On the New Orleans Levee, at the Catherine Wharf on the Lower East Side, the Ohio River waterfronts, the East End of London's Thames, the wharves of Port Royal and San Francisco, and at harbors much farther afield, in these locations, different classes, races, experiences, values, and music and movement priorities have met, mingled, and cross-fertilized. The great Mark Twain, a virtual bard of the Mississippi, captured this shifty, tricksy quality in several lyrical passages, both borrowed and original, some of which he even cribbed from his own prior writings, but all of which are solidly based in the practical, indeed life-and-death, personal, vernacular knowledge that a working riverboat pilot needed to have. Quote, "It was so hard to tell anything about the water, the damn things shift around so, never lie still 5 minutes at a time. You can tell a wind reef straight off by the look of it. You can tell a break, you can tell a sand reef, that's all easy. But an alligator reef doesn't show up worth anything. 9 times in 10, you can't tell where the water is. And when you do see where it is, like as not, it ain't there when you get there. The devils have swapped around so, meantime." Next, they got on an old fiddle, and one played, and one patted juba, and the rest turned themselves loose on a regular old-fashioned keelboat breakdown. End quote. Similarly, the Greek-Irish journalist Lafcadio Hearn, who was born on Lesbos, educated in France and England, and made a living as a journalist and translator in Cincinnati, New Orleans, Martinique, and eventually Japan, had this to say about the multi-ethnic neighborhoods of the 1870s Cincinnati waterfront, where Stephen Foster had worked as a young shipping clerk, and to which Eliza fled at the climax of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Those neighborhoods along the wharves were known in the period as Rat Row and Sausage Row, references to both their proximity to riverine pests and also their housing of recent German, Dutch, and Irish immigrants. Likewise, the city also included the largest per capita percentage of free blacks of any city in the Union. Hearn suggests that among that population there are many like, quote, "Mary, a bright mulatto with strongly Irish features and a slight form." And he says they talk alike and think alike and all live and look alike. And he concludes that such Creole identity seemed to predominate strongly in the veins of half the mulattoes of Bucktown, though he also mentions the tripartite ethnicities of Native American, African, Caucasian persons, who elsewhere were known as Maroons or Black Seminoles or Melungeons. Hearn was also aware of the appeal to his readers of the attractive novelty of theatricals at places like Old Pickett's Tavern at 91 Front Street on the Levee by real Negro minstrels, with amateur dancing performances by roustabouts and their girls. And he was aware of the creation of, quote, "considerable interest in quarters where one would perhaps least expect to find it." Yet it's in these same waterfront bars, literally facing onto the floodplain of the river itself, that Hearn collected songs like "Oh, Little Liza, Little Liza Jane," or Mobile Bay, a.k.a. "Johnny come down to high-low, that poor old man, which originated as a sea shanty, and the shanty Shiloh itself. In other words, waterfront societies have been as slippery, multi-textured, smelly, and fertile as the riverbanks themselves. I've written elsewhere on ship decks and wharves and the working-class neighborhoods that developed around them, and I've written of the soundscapes that came from those meetings. Hard soles on barn floors and wooden docks, work-hardened palms patting juba on thighs and cajones, gut strings vibrating over resonant wooden or hide soundboards. Yet, those historical soundscapes are more proximate and more ubiquitous even in our digitized 21st century than we might think. That's Turkey in the Straw. But before it was Turkey in the Straw, it was Natchez Under the Hill, a fiddle tune. And then it was Zip Coon, a minstrel song. In other words, that melody, played by the ice cream trucks on 8-bit chiptunes renditions, is a palimpsest, scraped clean, and at each iteration acquiring a new layer of associations and new layers of meaning. And yet with all of those other layers of meaning still buried beneath, like the layers of fertile alluvial soil deposited on the floodplains upon which new crops and new musics grew. Webster's dictionary includes a definition of the word bluff as a, quote, high, steep bank or cliff. And every riverbank will feature at some points along its watercourse such places, often bends or curves that flow around a geological formation more resistant to erosion, like the compacted sand and silt of Nola's original Vieux Carré in a bend of the Mississippi, or the limestone platforms of Ile-de-France on the Seine, places at which the flowing water might have undercut the bank, lowering the riverbed, while leaving those Webster Dictionary high, steep banks above. Elites also lived up above, away from the stench and disease of the river, with solid stone foundations impervious to flooding or erosion, literally lording it over those of the working class, whose lives were centered lower down the economic scale and down below in the liminal space of the ever-changing river. Faulkner, for example, describes a Native American observing the tides of history as they sweep across the lower Mississippi's ever-shifting course and seemingly through the sky. Quote, watching an ebb flux of alien nationalities as rapid as the magician's spill and banishment of inconstant cards, deswamping that whole vast flat alluvial delta-shaped sweep of land along the big river, the Old Man, building the levees to hold Native Americans off the land long enough to plant and harvest the crop, so that the steamboats carrying the baled cotton to Memphis or New Orleans seem to crawl along the sky itself. In fact, all along the Mississippi and its tributaries, observers of the river towns have frequently commented upon this same bi-level topographic and economic reality. Those commentators and locales include Julien Poitras de Lalande on the capture of the bluffs of Baton Rouge, Jackson, Mississippi, founded in 1821 at Lefleur's Bluff, and indeed Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Similarly, the lower neighborhoods of Davenport, Iowa, further north on the river, are described in Charles Edward Russell's 1928 The Lumberjack in language strikingly reminiscent, though perhaps rather moralistic, of Hearn's about Cincinnati in the 1870s. Quote, the morals of the neighboring towns declining with the morals of the woods, when the men were paid off now, the most of them trooped down to the settlement at Council Bluff, and spent their wages for 40-rod whiskey and in the dance halls with which every lumbering town was oversupplied. I have called these resorts dance halls, which is euphemism, and different from the name they were known by in the woods. By the same token, Memphis was described by Twain as, quote, a beautiful city, nobly situated on a commanding bluff overlooking the river. And he quotes an 1827 letter from a Mrs. Trollope in Life on the Mississippi regarding the ways in which, quote, at one or two points the wearisome level line is relieved by bluffs, as they call these short intervals of high ground. The town of Natchez is beautifully situated on one of those high spots, end quote. Though it is fair to surmise that Twain, in his early career as a pilot, came to know waterfronts down below at least as well as he did the colonnaded houses commanding the bluffs up above. Yet, it's from the lower towns, the waterfronts, floodplains, and working-class neighborhoods under the hill that the Mississippi's Creole music and movement exchange emerged. As, for example, in the tall tales and songs about the semi-legendary keelboatman Mike Fink, whose fact-based myth captures a brief historical moment before the advent of steamboats, when timber cut in the uplands would be hammered into crude rafts and flatboats, floated down the tributaries to the main watercourses of the Ohio and Mississippi, and then in turn to the Big River's mouth at New Orleans, there to be broken up as building materials for shipment worldwide. This is the era and the riverine world of keelboats and flatboats and Huck Finn's It's Lovely to Live on a Raft. It's the annual cycle of flooding and drying and planting and harvesting, the ends and curves of the Mississippi as the old father cut new channels and catheads, and the bends and curves and undercuts that gave us Memphis and Natchez and Council Bluffs. So, by way of framing James Henry Beard's Western Raftsman of 1846, let me introduce you to Mike Fink's hometown, Natchez under the Hill. The Upper Mississippi was likewise a zone for intercultural music and dance exchange ever since the first French Coureurs de Bois, which we know both because of literary history and ethnography and genetics. There is extensive documentation of those French trappers and traders' interaction with Native American communities, and of the centrality of music and dancing, often to the fiddle, to both, on the lakes and rivers. However, documentation of music and movement in the pre-electrical era is typically fragmentary, subjective, or impressionistic. And so one resource for filling gaps in the record of music and movement comes from the visual arts. Perhaps the best-known tropes of Western riverine music and dance in the antebellum period are iconic, romanticized images like the Jolly Flatboatmen by Missouri River painter George Caleb Bingham from 1847. But a more rigorous, revealing, and directly informed visual reporter is James Henry Beard, who died in 1893. Though he ended his life as a high society New York portraitist of children and pets, in the 1830s Beard married into a flatboat trader family based in New Orleans, and he spent his young manhood working the Mississippi. His 1846 Western Raftsman, which depicts a beached flatboat and its idle crew, was actually rejected by the New York Academy precisely because of its allegorical decadence. But the painting also shows white fiddle music and black hard-shoe dancing interacting in real time within riverine culture's mutable social and racial dynamics in ways that would echo forth on urban theatrical stages throughout the balance of the century and even beyond. Beard thus joins George Caleb Bingham and William Sidney Mount in a company whose careers and artistic catalogs reflect the sense of new expanded possibilities in the Jacksonian era. The iconographic evidence supplied by these vernacular painters has been somewhat neglected by musicology. Only Mount's works have seen much investigation, mostly because his ephemera reveal an especially wide range of musical interest. Yet in Mount's paintings and sketches from Long Island and New York City, and equally useful, though less obviously, the works of Bingham and Beard from the Mississippi and Missouri River landings, the social and musical interaction and synthesis, that is, the creolization of working-class black-white culture, is demonstrable and inescapable. Now, while Mount subtly excised working-class origins and experiences from his personal autobiography, pursuing an upward social trajectory, and Bingham clearly idealized his flatboatmen and keelboatmen, Beard's stance toward his own working-class background and subjects was more fluid and even contradictory. Born at Buffalo in upstate New York in 1814, Beard was a product of the same geographic and socioeconomic environments as the first wave of black-face practitioners. His family's immigration to the Ohio frontier, for example, exactly parallels that of Dan Emmett's, while, like Mount, Beard's eventual contact with New York's National Academy in the 1840s helped him fashion a later career which brought upper-middle-class respectability and a gradual change of topics and themes. But in the 1840s, he painted a series of pictures whose topics, critical stance, and allegorical content were far more ambiguous, defiant, and revealing than his later portraits of cats, dogs, and children. Now, contacts between blacks and whites on the frontiers and in the riverine context were often as contentious as collaborative. Throughout the Jacksonian period, there was competition for jobs on the frontiers, but such conflict did not preclude the opportunity and actuality of cultural exchange. While the musics that resulted are much better documented in the post-war era, their origins lie in the antebellum period. And although the evidence is sparser, the conditions and environments were available for similar interaction throughout the West and South, as they were indeed on the Atlantic seaboard and throughout the Caribbean. Like Bingham's better-known Jolly Flatboatman, Beard's 1846 Western Raftsman depicts vernacular music-making on the riverine frontier. Though Bingham was lauded as a kind of poet laureate of the West, not least because of the idealized romanticism of his allegory and the appeal of his artistic technique, Beard's perspective was grounded, as we've said, in a quite different experience. Described as something of a proto-bohemian, Beard, a working-class Whig and a nativist, initially resisted incorporation into the Eastern arts hierarchy, and in fact the suspicion was mutual. The art scholar J.J. Rash, for example, notes that Beard's portrayals of Western frontiersmen initially provoked negative receptions in the East, and Hush likewise observes of this particular painting that Beard had, quote, depicted whites and blacks interacting as equals in a way that for its time would have been disturbing. The black dancer and white fiddler are united in pose and gesture as well as by their common activity. The dancer is even slightly elevated, though he's also isolated from his fellows by the diagonal placement of the oar, end quote. Hush's precise critical reading of the iconography and allegorical intentions behind Western Raftsmen argues that the enemy isolation and decrepitude of the scene were intentional as well as allegorical. The cabin in ruins, the riverboat beached, the postures of the individuals indolent and ungraceful. However, neither his study nor any other addresses the concrete musical information that the Beard image reveals. I've elsewhere discussed the fascinating yet previously little remarked musical information contained in the Bingham, but here I'd like to focus upon the layers of allusion and detail in Beard's rendition of the white musician and the black dancer. The interaction of fiddle and percussive hard-shoe dance, the location of this impromptu performance on the roof of a flatboat, are themselves, of course, reminiscent of the Bingham, and for that matter also recall imagery of like dancing in the East, most notably the image Dancing for Eel's 1820 Catherine Wharf, which was subsequently troped extensively. In addition to a lounging hunter with two dogs, one curled up sleeping, and a chatting horseman whose steed is attempting to crop the sparse turf, 4 rivermen are depicted upon their beached boat, one lounging, his head propped in his arm, another leaning with crossed arms against a ladder, and 2 others engaged in musical exchange, a white fiddler and a black dancer. As with the Bingham, both musician and dancer are positioned on the wooden roof of a flatboat's cabin, a resonant surface, like the wooden wharf in Dancing for Eels, the barn floors of W.S. Mount's rural dancers, or for that matter the half-doors or rain barrels employed by Irish dance masters for the same purpose, and here elevated for a plain view. As was common in folk fiddling, the musician holds his instrument down on his chest, a posture that impedes shifting, but enhances both resonance and the ability to play fuller textured, unaccompanied double and triple stops, and also a technique perfectly suited to executing the simple, narrow-ranged binary dance tunes of the Anglo-Celtic tradition. Meanwhile, the black dancer, sleeves rolled up and shirt open, dances to the fiddle's strains. As Hush points out, the very interaction of black dancer versus white fiddler would have been perceived by East Coast critics as allegorically threatening. But more relevant for our purposes is the implicit cultural exchange that is going on. Though we cannot know the specifics of the tune being played, whether it is of Anglo-Celtic or African-American derivation, or perhaps whether it already reflects the crossover of tunes from one tradition to another, the visual evidence confirms white music and black dance interacting. Analogous to William Sidney Mount's paintings of rural whites dancing to the fiddle, but with elements of African-American body language in the physical choreography, so here with Beard's fiddler and dancer. The bent knee and arms akimbo of Jump Jim Crow iconography are here translated from the minstrelsy prints, or, more accurately, reveal the existing practices which both prints and minstrelsy practitioners and Beard himself observed and appropriated. In closing, I'd like to emphasize that these spaces, the spaces of the western and southern frontiers, the rivers and canals that defined them and drove them outward, the wharves and river bluffs upon and under whom the actual work was done, were both literally and allegorically a place of meetings. If Hush and Rash and the East Coast establishment understood the riverbank under the hill, beneath the bluffs, to be a place of laziness, decay, shifting instability, those spaces, like Cincinnati's Sausage Row, the New Orleans Levee, the Lower East Side's Catherine Wharf, were also all spaces within whose very cyclical instability of ground and movement and identity was made possible the exchange across boundaries, topographic, economic, experiential, and genetic, that made American music, and even our current, particularly painful moment of historical reckoning, possible, inevitable, and essential.